So welcome to episode 2 of VRTogether's Roundtable Series, where we're sitting down with experts and special guests that are leading the ways in all things VR and wellness. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can get information about future videos, as well as our email list. That's going to be linked down below to stay connected to our studio. So today with us is our founder and CEO, Richard Hoagland, along with our special guest today, Dr. Amanda Glueck. Dr. Glueck is an assistant professor of neurology at the University of Kentucky, the head of Glueck Labs, a lab that's focusing on exploring novel interventions to aid in recovery for individuals with mild cognitive impairment, and one of our research partners. So Dr. Glueck, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So first, to start off our conversation, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself as well as some of the work that you're doing at the university.
Yeah, no, thank you. So my background is basically, it started off in basic science, but my area of interest kind of shifted a little bit for my postdoc when I became interested in individuals who had suffered a concussion. Specifically, like, how do we help them recover? What does the recovery trajectory look like? And again, is there anything that we can do to kind of help speed along this process? When I moved to the University of Kentucky, I started looking at the effects of virtual, mixed, and augmented reality for individuals with mild cognitive impairment, like you said, Maggie. And that has just kind of grown since then. I look at individuals with age-related cognitive impairment as well as injury, acquired brain injury, which encompasses both concussion, traumatic brain injury, as well as stroke, and even COVID encephalopathy. And one of the nice things is that even using commercially available devices, something that has not been developed for rehabilitation purposes, we see cognitive as well as motor function improvement in these individuals, which has been an absolute delight to see. And it's a way of kind of getting the devices in the hands of the consumers that would benefit from them the most.
Absolutely. So I'm interested, what sparked your interest in working with game design? Because that is, obviously the focus of our studio, and I saw that is a feature of your lab as well.
So, one of the main things is, why do these video games help people with their cognitive function as well as balance? One of the things that's really interesting is that you don't need to be kind of consciously aware that it's something that's going to be helping you with your thinking and motor function. It's something that kind of develops organically just through the regular design of the game. Mm-hmm. Especially when you're looking at these kind of three-dimensional processes and these three-dimensional games where it's so much more than just looking at like a flat screen, mm-hmm. which in turn, the brain we think the brain interprets it as being a lot more realistic and therefore more beneficial, and helps to promote something called neuroplasticity, which is everything from growing new connections in the brain after an injury to also learning. Mm-hmm. Learning is considered a form of neuroplasticity as well. And so one of the ways I got interested in it is it's something that's accessible. More and more people have access to video games, and it's not just for kids. Actually, people that are in their 30s and 40s are some of the main users for gaming. And that was something that when I first started researching, I was kind of surprised by. I had never really been a gamer. I'm still not really a gamer, but I do enjoy playing video games. And, just looking at this as a way of encouraging people to be able to use and improve throughout the lifetime is kind of where my interest stemmed. And then once I got to see these more advanced technologies, they're just fun. And why wouldn't you want to study them?
Right. So I'm interested, how you kind of got connected with our studio, because that is one of our main goals is creating games for flourishing. And, we've seen that virtual worlds can help connect people that maybe would not have access otherwise. And as we delve into the research side of it, obviously we were connected with the university, so I'm interested in how that relationship formed.
Actually, it was all on Richard and another colleague, Dima. You guys reached out to me. I think it was either right before or as COVID was rolling. And
the days of wearing masks.
Yeah.
Every meeting, even the first time you meet somebody.
Yeah. I don't think I got to see your face for a full year in person. And I think you guys just reached out and said, hey, we're doing this really exciting project. Would you be interested in basically having a geek session. And I was like, I'm always up for a geek out session.
Heck yeah.
And you visited the lab, and I got to see an early prototype, and I saw, easily saw the potential of what these programs could do. And then when it came time to further the collaboration, when Richard was like, would you be interested? And I was like, absolutely. This is a perfect blending of kind of the project development as well as the experimental side for me, which is an interesting kind of exercise that I don't normally get to be involved in.
Yeah. And Richard, I'm interested, did you know about Dr. Glueck's research into therapeutic benefits of game design and or was that something that was ongoing already? And then it ended up just being the perfect marriage, between our technology and then your research as well.
I mean, I think you were, Amanda was doing, Dr. Glueck was doing, we've chatted up, was doing that research. And I think that's why we reached out. We found that, I mean, this is like 4 or 5 years ago now, but I think it was that we found that there was somebody at UK that was already doing work similar to what that I had started doing and was doing with another colleague at the University of Kentucky, Dima Strapkovsky. And at that point, like, I was thinking about this today, actually thinking about the past and everything. And a lot of things can be brought back to in 2017. I of all things, went on an artist residency, not like a research residency, but I spent most of my time, and I like this story because it feels a little like, I don't know, punk research. I didn't have access, like all research is, a lot of it's behind paid walls, but it was in Spokane, Washington. And if I went to Gonzaga, I could have access to the articles. So I would just walk down to their campus and print off like 100 pages of research papers for the week and go read them and come back. But like, that was not my world at all. So finding out about somebody at the University of Kentucky that was doing things from the research angle was really exciting. And I think that was actually why we initially reached out and met and had a geek out session. It was my first time using the HoloLens 2. I fought robots coming out of the walls in Amanda's lab. And then it became, then we started doing a formal collaboration that started small with a pilot and a senior in a independent living facility, and then has moved on into the bigger grant from the National Institute of Aging.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into what I would love to hear a little bit about is what research have we collaborated on, and then what are some of the findings that we're seeing from that?
Yeah, so one of our early projects together was looking at whether or not individuals with mild cognitive impairment in an assisted living facility, whether they enjoyed using the headsets as well as the, at that time it was just VRTogether. So it was like a socialization kind of program or a co-presence. And we went down, Dima and I went down with a couple, and Richard went down with a couple headsets, and we just had the ladies at the assisted living facility just try them out and say, what do you think? What do you like? What don't you like? And it was amazing to see like the residents just kind of light up. I think the program at that time was they went on a hot air balloon ride through the Alps, Swiss Alps, which who doesn't want to do that, especially when it's snowing here in Kentucky. And we got some really great feedback. We saw, what was working for the residents, what wasn't working. And from there, it kind of just has expanded into this new feasibility study where we're taking the singing club product that you guys have been working on and that had been sponsored by the National Institute of Aging. And again, just seeing like what do individuals and the study partner or loved one in that respect, what do they like about the program? What would they like to see changed about the program? But actually, even before that, I got ahead of myself, got too excited. We did a kind of early demonstration with individuals with expertise in cognitive impairment. So we brought it into the Sanders Brown Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at the University of Kentucky. And we had the physicians as well as the groups that work with people with cognitive impairment take a look at the early prototype of the product. and say like, this is what we could do with it. What would you suggest we add? And we got some great feedback from those colleagues. Basically everything from you should have the font bigger to this, this non-player character really should be kind of front and center. And it really, I think, helped to shape where you guys were able to then go to develop the product. And then once you guys did have the development, we were able to bring it in, and now we're in the process of showing it to individuals with cognitive impairment and a loved one to see what they like. Would this be something they'd use in the future? Could they see greater application than just using it in their population? And then also, again, like, what would they like to see change? What do they want to see stay the same? We've gotten some really great feedback.
Yeah. Richard, anything to add on that?
Just kind of an observation from coming outside of the world of research initially, and how much of a challenge it is to build these types of things. So, like, we can build things, but if we want outcomes, we need to build things that will have outcomes. But our expertise is in building VR applications, and we feel like we can make fun and enjoyable VR applications. But I think for outcomes, there needs to be that something more that actually fosters it based off research, and then the research to validate it. And then we work with, and this actually process going through this NIA grant has been, I think, the single best kind of learning experience of how it goes, how to do it well, the challenges it face, because then you bring in experts, and they have the knowledge on like what outcomes you want, and ideally what you would want to do, what the research says would foster those outcomes. And so you're trying to come to this middle ground, but it's really fun. But I think I never anticipated, like, it is quite a challenge because you're talking over kind of this gap. And so part of it's just like reducing the knowledge gap, because it's expertise, but it's expertise is like hard-won expertise in one area, and coming over that gap. So I guess not to add anything to the research or the findings, but just that it's been so fascinating to learn what it's like to run this type of, and still like to consider it's still a game, because I believe in like games being this broad thing that the definition of which some people might argue like the boundaries, it's not even a game. I say no, it is. But with this different outcome in mind, or enhanced outcome, not just fun, and then that is something like improving quality of life, or potentially, and this is where I defer to Amanda always to make sure that I use the proper language, but like to mitigate the effects of, or improve the quality of life of somebody with mild cognitive impairment. And this is where, like, can we delay anything there? I need to be cautious of like how I talk about it. But even that, I think, is an interesting example of like learning to talk across that divide, because I do think like the better we get at it, the more we can do really cool stuff.
No, exactly. And I mean, I'll jump in real quick there too. That's a limitation that we have in science in general. Scientists are really good at talking to scientists. And, same thing, like doctors really help to bridge that gap a lot of times, in the sense that they wear two different hats. And I should say like medical doctors. So, it's really difficult because like when Richard and I talk, sometimes we could be talking about the exact same thing, but we're using different terminology. And there can be a huge divide. We even have that across disciplines in science. And so I've gotten to learn a lot about the game development side of things, because, we're just like, oh yeah, well, you can totally do this. And Richard like has to rein me in and is like, not yet. I mean, yes.
You can with $1 million and 3 years.
Yeah. And so that I think has been really interesting from our side as well, is getting to learn more about the development side, because that's not something that everybody gets to have exposure to and experience with. And then same thing also when our patients or participants come in and they're like, well, I want the avatars to look more real. And we're like, okay, we'll provide that feedback. And then other people are like, yeah, I don't care. I mean, I can tell that it's my loved one, even if they don't look identical to them. And so it's been kind of an interesting dichotomy there, as well as is seeing what different knowledge bases in our participants look like, and even how they communicate what it is they're experiencing and what they're liking, and would like to see a little bit different.
That's really, y'all anticipated my next question, or one of my questions, which was, what is a challenge? You know, Richard, obviously you're coming from a background of game design. Dr. Glueck, you know, you're coming from the research, academic, medical side. That does seem like it would be a significant challenge, and communicating that to the patients as well and gathering feedback. So what are some of the ways that you are measuring outcomes, or what are some of maybe the things that you are looking for from the participants to see, you know, are we achieving our goals? Are we reaching these aims that we're setting?
So in some cases, we're fairly lucky in that there are surveys that are already developed and have already been validated, and they're out there. And that's anything from the physical enjoyment, which might not fit perfectly with what we're doing, but if our participants have questions, we just clarify, and we indicate that this particular survey hasn't been developed specifically for this assessment, but just answer the best you can. And then we also have a usability survey, which is kind of similar. Again, it's something that was developed outside of our working group that gives us some quantifiable metrics. So what I mean by that is something that we can actually measure. So once again, there I'm getting stuck in like the science lingo, right? But in addition, one of the things that we do, which is really, really nice with this study that you don't always see, is we sit down and we debrief and we chat with our participants, and we ask them a standardized set of questions, and we ask them to elaborate. Well, you said you liked the fact that the avatar looked like your spouse. Could you elaborate on that? In what respects? Was it the fact that, the skin tone was the same? They're like, well, they didn't have my eye color. I'm like, well, would that be something that you would like to see? Just trying to give something to our developer colleagues so that they can try and make a change in the software if it is needed. And then, other metrics about whether or not there's this phenomenon with virtual reality called simulator sickness, which ends up feeling an awful lot like motion sickness when you're using the headset. I happen to be one of the lucky or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, individuals that actually get simulator sickness with certain applications. So if it's something that I tolerate, I'm pretty confident our participants are going to be okay in it. So we're checking with them on that. We're checking to see whether or not they get headaches, which isn't necessarily an effect of the program itself, but it can be the fit of the headset, which is, again, something that I've gotten to learn about and experience over the course of running hundreds of subjects through various different gaming trials. And so, but again, like through those qualitative interviews, we really gather a lot of really rich data that we then can go back and look at and see what trends are reoccurring. So what are things that people are mentioning more frequently than others, and what's something that maybe is a little bit more individualized for the participants that might be something to consider, but it's not necessarily an overarching feature of everybody as a whole.
Interesting. Have you had any difficulties in working? I mean, I'm thinking specifically in maybe elderly participants, in them adopting virtual reality. This is a very new, in terms of the span of the technological history of, everything. It is relatively new, and I do feel that sometimes it can be a little bit of a challenge to immerse yourselves fully if you're brand new to it, especially if you're older. So I'm interested to hear if y'all have had any difficulties in that.
At least from my perspective, it's really interesting. One of the things that I was seeing with our even college age students when I first started doing this research is that they were responding to elements of the game that they've never witnessed in real life. What I mean by this is the game that I used and use still had a fireball that would come at you. Now, not many people have experience with fireballs, hopefully coming at them,
Yeah.
but they would say like eek or or jump and duck. And like some people would like hit the ground, other people would just dodge. But what really surprised me was how strong that reaction was in individuals. That most people, when I started doing this research, really didn't have as much experience with virtual reality, mainly because the cost was so high.
Mm.
It wasn't something that was really accessible to many people. And then you start looking at, looking at it in older populations, like you mentioned, Maggie. And one of the biggest barriers that we have is that people don't want to mess it up. They don't want to break the program. And it's like, no, unless you're going to take it off and like chuck it, you're not going to break it. And that's something that like my grandparents, they were always really concerned with when they were interacting with new technology. They're like, we don't want to mess it up. It's like you can't mess it up. And we've had people that are in their 60s and 70s that they've grown up with the adoption of higher and more advanced technology. They were there for the birth of the internet.
Yeah.
And so some people are really, really open to it. And those are the people that are going to naturally agree to participate in this study. So we are kind of getting in that context a slightly more biased sample, because people that are interested in technology are more likely to answer yes and say, yeah, of course I'll come in and check out some new tech. But also, that being said, is that we do have a number of people who are open to new experiences and who are interested in learning more. I think that regardless of our population, in terms of what their diagnosis has been, that's something that's really, really rewarding, is that natural curiosity, getting to see people kind of interact with new technology in that respect.
Yeah. And Richard, from a game design perspective, accessibility is one of the core values of our studio. How do you, take that feedback, make the game more accessible to populations that are utilizing it?
It's one of our core values because of the past 4 years of experience. So when the research kind of side of what we were doing started, specifically looking at isolation and loneliness with older adults. And it came out of a game that Daydream Blue that was back in 2015, but it had multiplayer and people could interact there. And actually, just as a quick aside, about the fireball, in that game there was a bug where you could skip stones and they would bounce and hit these musical notes, but sometimes they would come right back at your head, and no matter how many times I did it, my reptile brain would take over and I would die. But that's also kind of what made me believe there's something here that's creating a more immersive experience than when I play games, because I played games all my life. Because in that moment, that rock is as real to part of my brain as anything else, because it's not, there's no, whatever takes over is this thing is happening and we need to deal with it. To get back to the question, I think on the one hand, just to talk a little bit about the kind of what the research looks like in terms of phases. We're very much right now in that feasibility part to look at things like accessibility, with the idea that based off the results, we would then run further studies that would look at something like specifically the efficacy of the program. But first, we wanted to make sure that to something that Amanda said, even if the application is great, if it gives people a headache, which isn't even necessarily in our control because of the headset, because we choose to use a headset, that's still ultimately a losing scenario for nobody's going to want to do that if it gives them a headache. To get back to how do we translate it? It's one of the bigger challenges, but I think it's in general, anytime you're trying to take feedback and figure out how to incorporate it, because you have so much more feedback. You have lots of feedback of varying kind of levels. So one person might be giving a very abstract bit of feedback. Somebody might be giving something very specific, and then everybody has their own personal preference and ability to articulate and all these things. So you've got all this data, and the goal is to find kind of what Amanda had said about looking for patterns that arise, like mining it, find out of that those things that are kind of become apparently are the most important things to put in. And certainly for the accessibility thing, it would be like if a lot of people, and this is a pretty easy example that we would presumably see and fix, is if everybody's talking about some confusion over when they press this button, they don't know what's happening, and then the song starts, but everybody is expressing this frustration. We're like, okay, how can we give some sort of cue or visual suggestion as they press that button to alleviate that confusion, so that they're more understanding in that transition between pressing a button and having something be sung. I feel like I maybe halfway answered your question, so I'm having to go further, but I think it's just really like working with Amanda and team to understand what is the data that's coming out that is, say, patterns of behavior, or the most important because of potentially negative impact if we don't address it. And then sitting down as a pretty standard game design development challenge and just say, here's what we need to do. How do we build and modify the systems to address these issues? And then that point, we're basically just getting into our more comfortable area of game development, where it's like, okay, not to get super into it, but we would say, here's our goals over the next 2 months to address this. Here's the 2-week plans. Here's our task. And then we just work to, we do it, and then we test again, because we need to know if we actually addressed it, which is a big issue. Is you can think you're addressing something, and then you find out when you put it in front of people again that all the assumptions we made in the process of what we thought would fix it didn't in fact fix it.
And that's actually a really good point that I forgot to mention, is that most everyone that we've demoed these programs to want to come back. They want to see where it's going. And they've actually, even though it's not necessarily part of the study to do multiple demonstrations, we ended up doing it with our expert focus group, and it delayed us a little bit but they were so adamant that they were willing to see it again. We were like, okay, yeah, absolutely, we'll clear the schedule, we'll make it so that we can do a second demo based on your feedback. And so they have an element of investment in there too, because they're providing suggestions and they're seeing how we're taking it, how we're interpreting it. And I say we, but being Richard's team, obviously, and how the program is growing. And I think that's something that's really, really nice and really rewarding, because you don't necessarily get that a lot of times with research, especially like the biomedical field. And same thing with our participants, is they're like, hey, can I come back? Can I see this again? And we're like, of course you can, please. In fact, we'd love to continue to have your feedback. And that was one other thing in another study that I'm collaborating on with some other colleagues at UK, is that we're looking at the effects of using a different element or arm of the program in individuals who are just coming out of the medical ICU. And one of the things that some of the feedback that we got back from at least one participant was, can I continue to use this once I go home? And they actually, I think, ended up contacting the company, and they got a subscription because they liked it so much based on that one experience, which I think is really telling about what kind of impact the program has for people.
Yeah, and it must be so rewarding too as a participant to see some of the feedback, and you are a part of building what we are trying to build on both sides. That is something that us as a studio, we are always asking our community for feedback. We say, we want you to help us drive the boat, and build a thing that, keeps people coming back, that keeps people connected with each other, and really, decreases loneliness and improves wellness. So I think that's really beautiful that you get to experience that from the research side as well. Because like you said, I feel like that maybe is not as common in research, in medical settings. It's very rewarding. So just speaking a little bit more aspirationally, as we talk about people who are wanting to come back and see the apps and see the technology advance, where do you see virtual reality applying in a therapeutic sense in the future? If this was in a hospital setting or as part of an aging care facility, kind of what is your vision or thoughts about the future of virtual reality and wellness?
So I can see it having great application for reducing isolation and loneliness, like you were saying. There are a not necessarily small percentage, but there's a decent percentage of the individuals who come to the University of Kentucky who are coming from remote areas or who are coming from areas that are not in the Lexington and surrounding areas. Now, we know that in an ideal setting, family would be able to join them, but sometimes that's not feasible based on your socioeconomic status, based on what you've got going on at home. Maybe mom or dad are sick and somebody has to stay home with the kiddos and you can't uproot and bring them closer. I can see how this would have tremendous application to help keeping patients in touch with their loved ones, because while FaceTime is great, and it is great, sometimes it might be a little bit easier to help to escape the reality of being in a hospital. And I can see how that would be really, really beneficial. To say nothing of, it's boring. I don't know if anybody's ever been in a hospital, but like you're sitting there, you're hoping that you get well, and you really are only interacting, not that there's a problem with it, but your nursing staff, but they have a number of patients. And you only have the one or the handful of nursing staff that you interact with, especially if you're there by yourself, which again can be very lonely, can be very boring. We all know there's not necessarily great things on TV right now. Yeah. And, if you can sit there and you can kind of check out, mentally, at least from the hospital for a few hours a day, because you're getting to sing with somebody, or you're getting to chat in in a hot air balloon over the Swiss Alps with one of your loved ones from back home, that can be really, really beneficial for you, for the mental well-being of the patient. Additionally, this can have really great application, and it can help people recover after they've had a stroke. Like maybe they're not ready to be out of the hospital just yet, but we can still help use it potentially down the road as a way to assess whether or not it's safe for them to resume cooking. Another big thing that I'm interested in is whether or not your performance in one context, so using the game, can predict how you perform in another context, say driving. Can we use this to help indicate whether or not it's safe for somebody to return to driving or to return to usual activities or work? You can use it to simulate so much more in a safe and controlled environment, as opposed to either putting yourself and others at risk if you're trying to assess if somebody's ready to drive, or worrying about, maybe they're not ready to go to the grocery store by themselves and they're going to get kind of scared, disoriented, or whatever. We can help to assess that potentially using virtual reality, again, in a safe and controlled environment. That's where I really see it kind of going in the future, to say nothing about like the educational side of it, where you can use it to educate patients and educate family members. Like, hey, this is what a PET scan looks like, positron emission tomography. What does that mean? What does it do? Like teaching kids about it so they're less scared of medical procedures. There's just so much great application that you can use it for, beyond kind of like the socialization, which is still a huge and important component.
Yeah. And, the importance of socialization is so important. I mean, we are in a loneliness epidemic, in our country right now, and that is something that, requires people to find solutions, creative solutions for that. There is a word that we mentioned a little bit earlier, co-presence. I would love to hear a little bit from we've talked about that in our previous episode, but I would love to hear from Dr. Glueck your perspective, the power of co-presence and kind of how our brains are registering virtual as reality. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And it's something that I've been very interested in exploring. One of the kind of limitations, so one of the things that I was interested early on is looking at whether or not we need this more immersive technology. Is the two-dimensional just as beneficial? We don't know. One of the kind of big limitations is that there's no program that's the same throughout all these different modalities. So using a two-dimensional screen versus using something where it's a three-dimensional projection of an object in front of you. Is that level of detail important? My hypothesis, best guess, is absolutely. The more realistic we can make something, the more our brain is going to believe that it's real, which has benefits in terms of, really kind of getting, simplest way for me to explain it is buy-in from the brain. If it's real, then we're going to believe it. It gets encoded slightly differently in our head, right? Like as we're sitting here chatting, we've got three faces on the screen. It's a very different experience than if we're in a room together sharing a cup of coffee, geeking out, right, about our virtual reality. Right now, it's really difficult to, again, I'm going to use the word empirically measure. So how do we measure that in terms of, do you truly feel that this is a better experience than, chatting with somebody and in the room with you? My guess again would be yes for our extroverts out there. Our introverts might be like, no, I'm good. I like the screen. You can kind of guess which one I am there. But it's a question that we still have to answer. In the sense of co-presence, does feeling connected with somebody in a virtual environment really matter? Is it beneficial, or are we okay using the phone, using the iPad, using Zoom? Again, I tend to think that the answer is yes, because this is something that science fiction has been pondering and has been kind of teasing us with for years. If you look at like even the Star Trek, I'm a nerd, we already established that, but the Star Trek evolution, right? They have the holograms and they have the holodeck where you go and you interact, and it's not just simply sitting there and passively being involved and being engaged in the movie or in the story. It's being an active participant. And I think that in that context, it's going to be so much more beneficial than just interacting on a two-dimensional screen, which is our traditional technology.
I just wanted to add one quick thing talking about encoding, because I remember reading this article to cite it for one of the applications. To your point, and I feel like now I should also say Dr. Glueck,
Sorry,
instead of Amanda. And it was a study that had people watch a first-person view of somebody riding a motorcycle, but on a 2D screen. And then also, and I don't remember if they did both or how the experimental setup was, but the other version of it was a 360 video, and you wore a VR headset. And the finding was that people tended to encode the memory watching the 2D screen as watching someone drive a motorcycle, and encode the memory of the VR experience as I was riding a motorcycle. Like they clearly knew it wasn't an actual memory, but the way they talked about it, it seemed to be fundamentally different. And I always thought that was, fascinating. Like if that's the case, then is there a way that we're thinking about or encoding the way that we're relating to other people in a virtual environment when we can like play a game together with them that does make it kind of provide some of the value that provide whatever the things are we get from socialization that seem to be very important for us as social creatures, that perhaps Zoom has a little bit of that, and VR has this whole other area that you can't, because like we can't necessarily play we can't play basketball on Zoom together. Like there's no way to do it. And I mean, well, maybe we could like find out a way, but it would be very convoluted. But in VR we could play basketball, and it's not a one-for-one facsimile of the real world of basketball, but that like, I don't know. This gets into no scientific, like no science behind it. For my own speculation is like, yeah, totally. Like there's all sorts of things that are really valuable that occur when you start interacting with someone else in that virtual space. It's also been really fascinating to work and collaborate with folks to also kind of rein that in, because at first I was like, well, let's just like do this and this and this, and I kind of understand like got to take a lot of steps back and start building a foundation with rigor. Like you can't just jump to the very last idea and test that with no structure in place to kind of validate any of your assumptions. So it's been interesting to kind of understand that side of it as well.
Yeah, I think we do a fairly good job of balancing each other out, because when one of us starts getting like, oh yeah, we can totally do that, it's like, well, wait a minute. Like if it's between the science and then the game development, I was like, well, can't you do that? And Richard's like, we could, but that would take a really long time. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'll just hang on and answer that question later. So to be continued.
Yeah. On my side, it's like, can't we just research this? Well, we could, but like, there's 10 things you're assuming there. If you want anybody to take it seriously, you might want to start and do it to be continued on that and get to that question later.
I hate being a party pooper. Sometimes we gotta do it for science so that we actually understand what we're looking at.
Well, and
no, I get it.
And that's a perfect segue too. But going back, this conversation was kind of sparked when you both were talking about, the fireball or the rock coming at you. And Richard, I think you said our reptile brain, registers it as real. I know for myself, I'm new to virtual reality, before I was involved with the studio. And one of the first games I did was a roller coaster simulation. And I felt in my body, my brain was very like, oh, this is real. How our brain is interpreting reality, I find very interesting. And I'm wondering, is that something that can be measured? I don't know if EEGs or maybe even like eye tracking or anything like that. I know that medical tools are always advancing in terms of measurement. So I'm interested to see kind of how you might be able to see that, or in the future, how you could determine, how a brain is registering your virtual reality experience.
Yeah, so we can do some things which border kind of touchy on ethics, right? We can scare people,
yeah.
And some people are into that. I'm not really a big horror film fan, but that's one way, is that you get to see like how the reaction occurs. And the big thing with humans in general is that we have such a reliance on our visual system. So how our eyes interpret what's coming. The only reason that we're able to kind of perceive and be concerned about the fireball or the rock is because our visual system has such a strong component in how we interact with the world, right? And because of that, it kind of, in a lot of cases, takes over the way the brain functions. And for the most part, that keeps us safe. And sometimes it kind of trips us out. Like all of us have experienced sitting in a car at a stoplight or a stop sign and having the person next to you roll forward, and you feel like you're being sucked back. And so you slam your foot on the brake and your car is just like, dude, or your kid sitting next to you or your sister or whomever your passenger is. And so like that's an example of your visual system giving your brain incorrect information. And we get that a lot. Sometimes it's to the detriment, and sometimes it's because of a disorder or dysfunction. Other times it's just a kind of shortcut that we're so used to relying on that it makes us slam our foot on the brake when we're clearly not moving. There are ways that you can do that in research settings, like what we were talking about. I actually used to work with a balance device that actually would enable you to, in essence, diagnose where in the vestibular or the perception of standing upright, right? Your balance system, where the dysfunction was taking place, because it includes your visual system, your proprioception, or how you feel in space, your sensory system, so the weight of your feet on the ground and the pressure from your shoes and how your body moves, and then also your vestibular, so your inner ear and the other balance components. So all of that is what enables us to stand upright. So we can mess with that for science. And, you can see it also when people have some sort of disorder, and you can diagnose where in the system there is the dysfunction in that respect. You can do it through MRI. That's another one that's kind of fun, a little bit harder when you're talking about metal components sometimes. And I believe there's probably metal still on the headsets at this point. And you can do EEG. The EEG has a lot of artifacts based on like blinking and facial expressions. So I would have to go in there and like be really serious, which is hard for me in general. And also like moving your eyebrows. You guys see I don't sit still very well because I'm Italian. So the hands are going in the face. Yeah. And so like all of these things just kind of add artifacts in there. But one of the easiest things to do is to ask people how they feel, what they feel the difference is. And, providing that you're just kind of asking and you're allowing people to report what they're feeling and experience, you can get a lot of really rich information, which is a lot of what we're doing with our feasibility studies. Now, getting some empirical metrics are a little bit harder because it's hard to tease apart like what elements. You certainly can by using some of the tools that we talked about as well. And also by triggering the reptile brain into seeing if we can make you jump when, a clown jumps out at you. But there are ways of doing it. It's not necessarily as cut and dry, and you have to kind of go item by item and dissect it as you're moving forward to try and identify.
That's very
that's I guess the long answer.
No, that's perfect. That's exactly what I was curious about. Because it is one of those things, as we talked about, you have a lot of qualitative information, from interviews, how are you feeling, but the quantitative as well. I was really interested in understanding how you all are measuring, things or possibilities for that. So speaking of possibilities, as we kind of wrap up our call, looking ahead, I guess, are there other research directions that you're interested in pursuing? And this goes for both Richard and Dr. Glueck, from the game design side and then also from the medical research side. I guess, what are you, getting a little aspirational again, what directions are you excited about pursuing? Are there any findings that have really stuck out to you as worthy of, diving in further? I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
From the biomedical side, absolutely. For me, what I really like about this research is that you can really evoke a meaningful change in people's lives. So whether that's loneliness, we can empirically measure that. We have people use the program and see if it changes how they feel. That's the kind of simplest way. It's not by any means simple when you're talking about emotions and feelings, but that's lovely, because if you help a handful of people, then you're doing your job and you're making a meaningful impact in people's lives. I'm interested in also looking at we have another line of research that I work with is individuals with intellectual disability. So looking at the Down syndrome population, is this something that they would enjoy? Is this, because one of the things that came out of COVID for that population is they'd have a really hard time reintegrating, because we told them for so long, be careful, you can't go out, you can't do this. And it's hard. It's been hard for everybody, and it's been very hard for that population as well. Can we use this to help them bridge the geographic distances, and so they feel like they're part of the community again, as well as as their parents age, they might not be able to engage in as many activities as they used to. So, for me, anything that we can look at where it's a meaningful impact in people's lives is a path that I'd be interested in pursuing. And so long as Richard's happy for me to keep tagging along, then I'm in.
No, good. I mean, yeah, no, love having you as part of the team. I wish that we had a whole we're not even big enough to have divisions, but I don't know. I envision a future where we have a whole area dedicated to research. It's a little bit tricky because like we're a for-profit company, so the grants we get are for small businesses, but most granting is for research institutions and nonprofits. So I don't know exactly how we're going to do it, but there's so many areas, and some like not to the creation of products ultimately is something that we're passionate about because that means that we can get it out into the world, and so that's like the translation of taking it from the rigor of having it being validated in our claims, and then the translation of that out into the real world to know that like, okay, it's a consumer say device, and so we can look at how many people are buying it, we can look at how many people are using it, we can look at those numbers and everything. I would love with that to do some other stuff, and some of it's pretty out there. I don't know. I think in my background, I got an art degree. Like, there's a guy out of Barcelona that was at the University of Barcelona that I read about years ago. Mel Slater, I think is the individual's name. They would do stuff, and this is before like the headsets were even good like they are now, but like put a camera behind somebody, put on a VR headset, and then they would be seeing themselves in the third person from behind them. Like, this kind of stuff is wild, but
terrifying.
But I feel like, I don't know, I don't know. I feel like there's some really interesting things you could learn. And with EEG, like, I actually tried to do this with an EEG someone loaned me from UK, but I couldn't get it to work right. But to get the EEG signals into the VR headset as a visualized like point cloud, so that I could be immersed in like a visualization of the behavior. I don't know. If you know how we can get money for this, I think it would be super fun. But all that to say, also, like, everything we're doing, in fact, this conversation has helped kind of remind me of how it came to be that we're now specifically talking about like games for flourishing. It's just a phrase to encapsulate like learnings of the past 5 years along this, and especially with the like impact part of it. That's really cool too, from a game developer side, because it's also not something I ever expected necessarily to see. Is like that individual who emailed this note about the ICU, and I was like, oh, this is gonna make me cry. Like, this is impacting somebody's life in a positive way. Like, man, that's amazing. But then it's like, okay, but how can we get it to a lot more folks than the one person? That's the goal.
It's all baby steps leading up to that ultimate goal.
You know, and as virtual reality becomes more accessible, I think people are adopting it more and more, which just gives more opportunity, you know, for us to continue the work that we're doing. All right. Well, Richard, Dr. Glueck, thank you so much for such a great conversation. I love learning, you know, and I'm sure all of our viewers will love learning about what we're doing and kind of the future of VR and wellness and opportunities there. Thank you so much to anyone who is watching. Please subscribe to our channel for future episodes with more special guests, and also sign up for our email list that is going to be linked below. Thank you so much.